and thanks to all the witnesses for being here. Ms. Janot, I want to start with a question for you. In New Hampshire, I hear from families about the burden that rising housing costs have had on their ability to live and work in our state. And it also obviously hurts businesses. The story I am hearing repeatedly right now is we've made an offer to a really valuable recruit to come into the state and work for our business, and they not only can't afford a place to live, they can't find a place, even if they could afford it. So part of the reason that we're seeing rising housing costs in New Hampshire and around the country is obviously a lack of supply. And that's why additional federal support for programs to support housing construction, like the low-income housing tax credit, is critical. Can you discuss how states can use programs like the low-income housing tax credit to address the shortage of workforce housing?
Sure. We talked earlier about the MyTech proposal that Chairman Wyden has introduced, and that really is an important tool to really capture that group that doesn't qualify for the low-income housing tax credit, is trying to move up the economic scale. However, their wages are not keeping pace with the increased cost of housing. Again, housing isn't the only sector of our economy that has experienced incredible cost increases, particularly since COVID. Food, energy, other sectors as well. We've seen those more in real time because they're implemented pretty quickly when those cost increases go up. In the housing sector, however, it's much more of a lagging indicator, particularly in the rental side, particularly in part because people sign one-year leases, they get renewed at different times. So those costs from COVID are really just hitting our sector right now. So we need as many tools in the toolbox as we can to develop increased supply in communities, both suburban, urban, and rural.
Well, thank you. And I want to turn to the issue of rural housing now. And Ms. Scott, I have a question for you, and I know Senator Grassley, and I just heard Senator Tillis talk a little bit about it too. Ms. Scott, in your testimony, you note that investments in quality housing not only supports families, but also strengthens the economy and supports employment. I hear from constituents all across my state, including those in rural areas like our North Country, that expanding housing options is necessary to expand economic opportunity. How can we leverage the tax code and expand existing federal housing programs to help make housing more affordable for rural families?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. For one, we can provide a basis boost for the projects in rural communities. This would go a long way to help deals pencil out that currently do not. We can align the income limit requirements. There's a difference between the income limit requirements to rural communities between the housing credit and the private activity bonds, and that difference leads to also a gap in terms of how we can finance. And then lastly, I would say that providing the basis boost for projects serving Native communities would also help in terms of we should require states, I think, to provide a selection preference that allows more projects to serve Native communities. When you combine sort of fixes like that, I think we begin to get to addressing some of the gaps in providing housing in both rural communities and Native communities and the like.
That's very helpful. Thank you. An additional question for you, Ms. Scott. In addition to increasing the supply of housing, it's essential that we provide additional support for families working to achieve home ownership. That's why last Congress I introduced bipartisan legislation which was called the Middle Class Mortgage Insurance Premium Act to provide tax cuts for middle-class homebuyers who use mortgage insurance. Can you discuss how mortgage insurance can make home ownership more accessible, and how else can we continue to cut housing costs for families?
Sure. The issue there is that home buyers who can't afford the 20% down payment are required to purchase mortgage insurance, and that requirement prohibits a lot of families from actually going forward with home ownership. So for first-time home buyers, minority home buyers, those are the ones that we really, really want to focus on. And I think that, as noted earlier in the testimony, the gaps in terms of their the limit in income and the limits in savings, this will help us to address that gap. and make it more available, make homeownership more available to many more families. This is also why we support increasing funding to other housing programs that can provide down payment assistance as well, like, for example, CDBG and Home, and the USDA Rural Housing Services single-family programs. So we say combining all of those other resources to increase the availability of home ownership down payment assistance.
Well, thank you very much. That's very helpful, and thank you, Mr. Chair.